The moment Tyler Brooks grabbed the hem of my cardigan and sneered, "Let's see what the scared little teacher is hiding under all these layers," I felt something snap inside me that had been dormant for 3 years. What he didn't realize was that beneath my modest sweaters and nervous demeanor lived someone who could dislocate his shoulder in under 2 seconds without breaking a sweat. But watching his cocky grin falter as my hand moved to intercept his wrist, I knew my carefully constructed, peaceful existence at Riverside Preparatory Academy was about to shatter like glass. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for 8 months at Riverside Preparatory Academy, I had perfected the art of invisibility. Every morning I would slip through the faculty entrance wearing my signature oversized cardigans, thick-rimmed glasses perched on my nose, and my dark hair pulled back in the same unremarkable bun I'd worn since my first day. To the students, I was just another forgettable teacher who spoke in whispers and jumped at her own shadow. To my colleagues, I was the quiet English literature instructor who ate lunch alone in the corner of the faculty lounge, grading papers while everyone else gossiped about student drama and weekend plans. What nobody at Riverside knew was that Sarah Mitchell, the timid teacher, was a carefully constructed facade. 3 years ago, I had been Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Army Special Forces, stationed in places I still couldn't talk about, doing things that haunted my dreams and made me wake up in cold sweats. I had hands that could kill in 7 different ways, and a mind trained to assess threats and neutralize them before most people even realized danger was present. But after my discharge, after the mandatory therapy sessions and the long journey back to something resembling normal life, I had made myself a promise. Never again would I use violence as a solution. Never again would I be the weapon I had been trained to be. Teaching had seemed like the perfect refuge. Literature was safe, predictable, contained within the boundaries of books and discussion questions. At Riverside Preparatory Academy, nestled in the affluent hills of Millbrook Valley, Connecticut, I thought I had found the peace I desperately needed. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover my small apartment and help with my mother's medical bills, but it felt like redemption. Here, surrounded by classic novels and eager young minds, I could be someone entirely different. Someone gentle. Someone harmless. The students at Riverside came from a different world than anything I had known growing up. Their parents were hedge fund managers, pharmaceutical executives, and old money families whose names graced buildings throughout New England. These kids drove cars worth more than my annual salary and wore watches that cost more than most people's rent. They lived in a bubble where consequences were suggestions and rules were optional if your family donated enough to the right causes. For the first 7 months, my strategy of invisibility worked perfectly. I taught my classes with quiet competence, assigned essays on Shakespearean themes, and managed to avoid any real conflict with students or faculty. My classroom, room 204B in the far corner of the academic building, became my sanctuary. The isolation that might have bothered other teachers suited me perfectly. Fewer interruptions, less drama, more opportunities to lose myself in the worlds created by Austen and Dickens and Bronte. But everything changed on a gray October morning when Tyler Brooks walked into my advanced placement English literature class with the kind of swagger that immediately set my nerves on edge. Tyler was everything I instinctively recognized as a threat, even though he was just an 18-year-old high school senior. 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of someone who spent serious time in the weight room, Tyler had the piercing blue eyes and perfect bone structure that probably made most of his female classmates swoon. His blonde hair was always styled with the kind of casual perfection that suggested both expensive products and natural confidence, and he wore the Riverside blazer like it was a military uniform designed to announce his superiority. What made Tyler dangerous wasn't his physical presence, though that was intimidating enough. It was the cold calculation behind his charm, the way he could shift from devastating smile to icy threat in the span of a heartbeat. I recognized the type immediately from my military days. Tyler was a predator who had learned early that rules didn't apply to him, that his family's wealth and influence created a protective bubble where he could operate without consequences. His father, William Brooks, owned Brooks Construction Empire, one of the largest development companies in Connecticut. The Brooks family had donated millions to Riverside over the years, funding everything from the new gymnasium to the computer lab that bore their name. Tyler knew exactly how much protection that money bought him. And he wielded that knowledge like a weapon against anyone who dared to challenge him. The first sign of trouble came during our unit on Macbeth. Tyler had been assigned a comparative essay analyzing the themes of ambition and moral corruption, a topic that should have been perfect for someone with his obvious intelligence. Instead, he submitted 3 pages of rambling nonsense that read like it had been generated by artificial intelligence and poorly edited by someone who hadn't actually read the play. When I handed back his paper with a D- and a note requesting he see me after class, Tyler's entire demeanor shifted. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. His voice carried the kind of entitled disbelief that suggested he had never received a grade lower than a B in his entire academic career. "This is quality work, Miss Mitchell. Maybe you just don't understand my writing style." I kept my voice calm and professional, the way I had been trained to de-escalate situations long before I became a teacher. "Tyler, we can discuss this after class. The feedback on your paper explains exactly what needs improvement." But Tyler wasn't interested in private discussion. He stood up from his desk, all 6 feet of him looming over the small classroom, and crossed his arms in a gesture of pure defiance. "No, I think we should discuss this right now, in front of everyone, because I think you're being unfair, and I think the class deserves to know how their teacher really operates." The other students sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes darting between Tyler and me like they were watching a tennis match. I could see some of them shifting nervously in their seats, recognizing the electricity in the air that preceded real conflict. Marcus Rivera, Tyler's best friend and constant companion, leaned back in his chair with an anticipatory grin, clearly expecting to be entertained by whatever was about to unfold. "Tyler," I said, my voice steady despite the familiar spike of adrenaline that always preceded confrontation, "please take your seat. We can resolve this appropriately after class." "Appropriately?" Tyler laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You mean where you can threaten my grade in private? Where you can try to intimidate me without witnesses?" "I don't think so, Miss Mitchell. I think we handle this right here, right now." He stepped closer to my desk, close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. This wasn't teenage frustration or academic disappointment. This was a predator testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before encountering real resistance. I had seen the same look in the eyes of enemy combatants who thought they could intimidate their way out of captivity. "Your essay failed to meet the basic requirements of the assignment," I said, keeping my voice level while my mind automatically cataloged his positioning, his probable reach, the distance to the door. "You're welcome to revise and resubmit for partial credit, or we can discuss alternative approaches to demonstrating your understanding of the material." Tyler's smile widened, but it was the kind of expression that belonged on a shark, not a high school student. "Alternative approaches, I like that. How about this for an alternative approach, Miss Mitchell? How about you change my grade to something more appropriate for someone whose family has contributed more to this school than your pathetic salary for the next decade? How about you remember who really has power here?" The classroom fell into the kind of silence that felt dangerous, pregnant with possibilities I didn't want to consider. I had spent 3 years building a new identity based on peace and conflict avoidance, but Tyler Brooks was systematically dismantling every boundary I had carefully constructed. He was pushing me toward a response I had sworn I would never give again. "The grade stands," I said quietly. "You're welcome to discuss this with your parents, your counselor, or Principal Walsh. But academic standards are not negotiable." Tyler's face flushed red, the charming mask slipping to reveal something much uglier underneath. "Academic standards? From someone who probably got her degree online? From someone who dresses like she shops at thrift stores? You think you can judge me?" He leaned forward, placing both hands on my desk and bringing his face close enough that I could feel his breath. "Let me explain something to you, Miss Mitchell. My family owns this place. My father's donations paid for half the building we're sitting in. One phone call from me, and you'll be looking for a new job before the end of the week. So why don't you reconsider that grade?" I stood up slowly, matching his gaze with the kind of steady calm I had learned in situations far more dangerous than this one. "Tyler, you need to step back and return to your seat immediately. This conversation is over." For a moment, something flickered across his face that might have been surprise. Clearly, he wasn't accustomed to anyone standing up to him, especially not the quiet teacher he had probably dismissed as an easy target. But the surprise quickly transformed into something that looked suspiciously like excitement, as if he had finally found someone willing to play the game he enjoyed most. "Or what?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "What exactly are you going to do about it, Miss Mitchell?" The bell rang before I could answer, breaking the tension like a hammer through glass. Students began gathering their books and shuffling toward the door with the kind of nervous energy that suggested they couldn't wait to escape the confrontation they had just witnessed. Tyler straightened up slowly, his eyes never leaving mine, and picked up his backpack with deliberate casualness. "Think about what I said," he told me as he headed for the door. "Think real hard about whether this is a fight you want to have." As the classroom emptied, I sank back into my chair and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 10 minutes, Tyler Brooks had managed to shatter the careful equilibrium I had spent months building. He had identified me as a target, tested my boundaries, and discovered that I wouldn't back down easily. Worse, he had done it all in front of an audience, which meant our conflict was now public knowledge that would spread through the school's gossip network within hours. I thought about reporting the incident to Principal Walsh, but I already knew how that conversation would go. Tyler's father was one of the school's most generous donors, and teenage confrontations over grades were hardly unusual. Unless Tyler actually threatened violence or crossed some other clear line, the administration would likely treat this as a personality conflict that we needed to resolve ourselves. That afternoon, as I walked to my car in the faculty parking area, I found Tyler waiting by my ancient Honda Civic with Marcus Rivera and Dylan Chen flanking him like bodyguards. Dylan had his phone out, apparently recording whatever was about to happen, while Marcus cracked his knuckles in a gesture that was probably supposed to be intimidating. "Miss Mitchell," Tyler called out cheerfully, as if our earlier confrontation had never happened. "We wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding in class today. Didn't we, guys?" Marcus and Dylan nodded enthusiastically, but their grin suggested they found something hilarious about the situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I approached my car cautiously, keys already in hand, while my mind automatically assessed the tactical situation. 3 athletic teenagers, isolated location, no witnesses except Dylan's phone camera. "Apology accepted," I said neutrally, moving toward my driver's door. "Have a good afternoon." But Tyler stepped sideways, blocking my path to the car door with a movement that looked casual but was clearly intentional. "Actually, we were hoping we could continue our discussion about academic standards. Really get to understand your perspective." "The appropriate place for that discussion is during office hours or through the administration," I replied, noting how Marcus had moved to block my retreat while Dylan continued filming. "Please step aside so I can leave." Tyler's smile widened. "Oh, but Miss Mitchell, this is so much more private, so much more personal. Don't you think some conversations are better handled away from official channels?" He reached out as if to touch my arm, and I stepped back quickly, bumping into Marcus, who had somehow appeared directly behind me. The contact was brief, but it sent a clear message about how easily they could surround me, how vulnerable I was in this isolated location. "Oops," Marcus said with a laugh. "Sorry, Miss Mitchell, didn't see you there." "You seem nervous," Tyler observed, tilting his head like he was studying an interesting specimen. "Is there something about us that makes you uncomfortable? 3 honor students just trying to have a conversation with their teacher?" Dylan giggled from behind his phone camera. "She does look scared, doesn't she? Like she's never been around teenage boys before." I kept my breathing steady and my voice calm, even as my military training whispered urgent suggestions about pressure points and joint locks. "I'm not nervous. I'm professional. This conversation is inappropriate and I'm leaving now." "Inappropriate?" Tyler repeated, savoring the word. "That's interesting. What exactly do you think we're doing that's inappropriate, Miss Mitchell?" He stepped closer again, close enough that I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. This wasn't about the grade anymore, if it ever had been. This was about power and control, about a privileged teenager who had discovered a new toy to break. "We're just talking," he continued. 3 students having a respectful conversation with their teacher. Nothing inappropriate about that, is there? But his body language told a different story. The way he invaded my personal space, the way his friends had positioned themselves to limit my escape routes, the way Dylan kept filming despite my obvious discomfort. Everything about the situation was designed to intimidate and humiliate. "Please move away from my car," I said firmly. "This conversation is over." Tyler laughed, but it was the kind of sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, Miss Mitchell, this conversation is just getting started." See, the thing about conversations is that they require participation from both parties. And you haven't really been participating, have you? He reached out again, this time making contact with my shoulder before I could step away. The touch was brief and could have been dismissed as accidental, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I reacted. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice carrying a warning that Tyler either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. "Touch you?" he said with mock innocence. "Miss Mitchell, I barely brushed your sweater. Are you really that sensitive? That fragile?" Marcus and Dylan laughed like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. But their laughter had an edge to it that suggested they understood exactly what game their leader was playing. "Maybe that's the problem," Tyler continued, circling me slowly while his friends maintained their positions. "Maybe you're just too delicate for a place like Riverside. Maybe you're not tough enough to handle students like us." The irony of his words was almost overwhelming. If only he knew exactly how tough I was. How many ways I could end this confrontation before any of them understood what was happening. But I had made a promise to myself, a promise to be someone different, someone better than the weapon I had been trained to be. "I'm going to my car now," I said, moving toward the driver's door with determination. This conversation is finished. But Tyler wasn't finished. As I reached for the door handle, he grabbed my wrist with enough force to stop my movement and spin me around to face him. The contact was no longer ambiguous or deniable. It was assault, plain and simple. "Actually," he said, his grip tightening painfully around my wrist, "I think this conversation is finished when I say it's finished. Don't you agree, Miss Mitchell?" For just a moment, muscle memory took over. My free hand moved toward his throat. My body shifted into a combat stance. And every instinct I possessed screamed at me to neutralize the threat he represented. But I caught myself just in time, forcing my body to remain passive, even as Tyler's grip left marks on my skin. "Let go of me," I said quietly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that seemed to surprise him. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or the first hint of uncertainty. He had expected me to be afraid, to beg or plead or try to negotiate. He hadn't expected calm defiance from the quiet teacher he had dismissed as weak. But the moment passed quickly, and his grip tightened rather than loosened. "I'll let go when you apologize for disrespecting me in class today, when you admit that you made a mistake with my grade." "I won't apologize for doing my job," I replied, "and I won't change a grade you didn't earn." Tyler's face darkened with genuine anger now, the charming mask slipping completely away to reveal the entitled monster underneath. "You know what, Miss Mitchell? I think you need a lesson in respect. I think you need to understand exactly who has power in this relationship." He released my wrist only to grab the front of my cardigan, his fingers twisting in the soft fabric. "Maybe it's time you stopped hiding behind all these layers and showed us what you're really made of." And that was when I knew that my 3 years of peaceful existence at Riverside Preparatory Academy were about to come to a very violent end. The next morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn clarity that made Millbrook Valley look like a postcard. But I felt anything but peaceful as I pulled into the faculty parking lot. My wrist still bore the faint purple fingerprints from Tyler's grip the day before, hidden beneath the long sleeves of yet another oversized cardigan. I had spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, replaying the confrontation, and trying to convince myself that it was an isolated incident, that Tyler would lose interest and move on to easier targets. I should have known better. Predators like Tyler Brooks didn't abandon prey once they detected weakness, and my refusal to back down had apparently triggered something in him that I recognized all too well from my military days. He had found someone who wouldn't immediately submit to his intimidation tactics, which made me infinitely more interesting than the usual targets who crumbled at the first sign of his displeasure. The faculty lounge felt different that morning, charged with an undercurrent of whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever I entered earshot. Lisa Thompson, the PE teacher who had always been friendly in a casual, professional way, approached me as I was preparing my morning coffee with an expression of concern that made my stomach clench. "Sarah," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard, "I heard there was some kind of incident yesterday with Tyler Brooks. Are you okay?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. Lisa was one of the few faculty members who seemed genuinely invested in doing right by both students and colleagues. But even she carried herself with a careful diplomacy that came from years of navigating the treacherous waters of private school politics. "It was nothing serious," I replied, stirring my coffee with more attention than the task required. "Just a disagreement about academic standards." Lisa's expression suggested she wasn't buying my minimization, but she also wasn't the type to push when someone clearly didn't want to discuss something. "Tyler can be challenging. His family's influence makes things complicated when issues arise." The careful way she chose her words told me everything I needed to know about how previous conflicts with Tyler had been resolved. Money talked louder than teacher complaints, and administrative priorities ran toward keeping wealthy donors happy rather than supporting faculty who dared to hold students accountable. "I can handle it," I said, meaning it more than she could possibly understand. The problem wasn't whether I could handle Tyler Brooks. The problem was handling him in a way that didn't violate every principle I had built my new life around. "I'm sure you can," Lisa replied, but her tone suggested she had her doubts. "Just remember that some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when the other side has all the institutional power." Her words followed me through the morning as I prepared for my classes, arranging lesson plans and reviewing student assignments while part of my mind remained focused on tactical considerations I hadn't needed to think about in 3 years. Where would Tyler try to corner me next? How far was he willing to escalate? What were his probable moves, and how could I counter them without compromising my commitment to nonviolence? My first period class proceeded normally, filled with juniors who seemed blissfully unaware of the drama brewing between their teacher and one of the school's most prominent seniors. We discussed themes of power and corruption in Julius Caesar, and I found myself drawing uncomfortable parallels between Shakespeare's ambitious characters and the entitled teenagers who populated Riverside's hallways. But second period brought Tyler back into my classroom, along with Marcus and Dylan, and the atmosphere immediately shifted from academic to adversarial. Tyler entered with the kind of swagger that announced his intention to cause trouble, settling into his seat with exaggerated casualness, while his friends flanked him like bodyguards preparing for battle. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," Tyler said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you had time to think about our conversation yesterday." I continued writing the day's objectives on the whiteboard, refusing to be drawn into whatever game he was planning. "Good morning, Tyler. Please take out your copy of Hamlet. We're beginning Act 3 today." "Oh, I have thoughts about Hamlet," Tyler said, leaning back in his chair with the kind of confidence that came from knowing he held all the cards. "Especially about characters who pretend to be something they're not. Characters who hide behind masks and think no one can see their true nature." The pointed nature of his comment wasn't lost on anyone in the classroom. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the undercurrent of hostility but not understanding its source. Marcus and Dylan exchanged glances and barely suppressed grins, clearly anticipating whatever performance their leader had planned. "That's an interesting observation," I replied calmly, turning to face the class. "The theme of appearance versus reality is central to the play. Can anyone identify specific examples of characters whose public personas don't match their private intentions?" A few hands went up, but Tyler spoke before I could call on anyone. "Well, there's Hamlet himself, obviously, pretending to be crazy when he's actually plotting revenge, acting weak and harmless when he's actually dangerous." His emphasis on the words made it clear he wasn't just discussing Shakespeare anymore. This was a direct challenge, a verbal probe designed to test my reactions and possibly provoke a response that would justify whatever escalation he had planned. "That's a good start," I said neutrally. "Who else can identify examples of deceptive appearances in the play? What about characters who seem gentle and harmless but are actually hiding violent tendencies?" Tyler continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "Characters who pretend to be peaceful but are really just waiting for the right moment to strike?" The classroom fell silent except for the sound of nervous fidgeting and barely audible whispers. Every student understood that we were no longer discussing literature, that something much more personal and dangerous was happening between their teacher and Tyler Brooks. I could see fear in some of their faces, excitement in others, and uncertainty in all of them. "Tyler," I said quietly, meeting his gaze with steady calm, Your analysis would be more effective if you supported it with specific textual evidence. Can you cite passages that support your interpretation?" He laughed, but the sound had a sharp edge that made several students flinch. "Oh, I think the evidence is pretty clear, Miss Mitchell. Sometimes people reveal their true nature through actions rather than words." Marcus leaned forward in his seat, apparently unable to contain his anticipation any longer. "Yeah, Miss Mitchell, sometimes people aren't what they seem. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you really need to watch out for." Dylan had his phone out again, positioned to capture whatever was about to happen while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. The sight of the camera sent a familiar spike of adrenaline through my system, activating threat assessment protocols I hadn't used in years. "Gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice level, despite the warning bells going off in my head. "We're here to discuss Hamlet, not to engage in personal speculation. Please direct your energy toward the assigned reading." But Tyler was clearly done pretending this was about academics. He stood up from his desk with deliberate slowness, his full height and athletic build suddenly seeming much more intimidating in the confined space of the classroom. "You know what, Miss Mitchell? I think we need to have another private conversation. Just like yesterday." The threat was unmistakable now, delivered in front of 24 witnesses who suddenly found their textbooks extremely fascinating. I could feel the weight of their attention, the electric tension that preceded either violence or complete capitulation. Tyler was gambling that I would back down rather than escalate in front of an audience, that my professional demeanor would protect him from any real consequences. "Sit down, Tyler," I said firmly. "You're disrupting the class." "Disrupting?" he repeated with mock surprise. "I'm just trying to understand the material, Miss Mitchell. Trying to learn about characters who hide their true nature. Isn't that what education is all about?" He began walking toward my desk with predatory confidence, each step calculated to increase the pressure and force a reaction. Marcus and Dylan remained seated but alert, ready to spring into action if their leader needed support. The other students sat frozen, caught between fascination and terror as they watched their quiet English teacher face down the school's most notorious bully. "Return to your seat immediately," I commanded, letting a hint of authority creep into my voice for the first time since the confrontation began. "This is your final warning." Tyler stopped just short of my desk, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the calculating coldness in his blue eyes. "Final warning. That sounds almost threatening, Miss Mitchell. Are you threatening me?" The question was a trap, designed to make me look either weak or unprofessional regardless of how I answered. If I backed down, he would see it as permission to escalate further. If I stood firm, he could claim I was being aggressive and inappropriate toward a student. "I'm maintaining classroom discipline," I replied evenly, "something that requires your cooperation." "Cooperation?" Tyler mused, savoring the word like expensive wine. "I like that. Cooperation requires mutual respect, don't you think? And respect has to be earned." He leaned forward, placing both hands on my desk and bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. The position was clearly intended to intimidate, to make me feel small and vulnerable, while demonstrating his physical dominance to the watching students. "The question is," he continued in a whisper loud enough for the front row to hear, "what are you willing to do to earn that respect, Miss Mitchell?" The implication was crystal clear, and I felt something cold and dangerous stir in my chest. Tyler Brooks had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had moved from academic intimidation to something that bordered on sexual harassment. The professional restraint I had maintained for 8 months began to fray around the edges. "Step back," I said quietly, my voice carrying a warning that Tyler either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. "Now." Instead of complying, he smiled wider and leaned even closer. "Make me." The 2 words hung in the air like a challenge to single combat, and I felt every muscle in my body tense in preparation for action. Tyler had just made the kind of mistake that got people seriously injured in the world I used to inhabit, but this wasn't that world. This was a classroom full of impressionable teenagers, and I was a teacher who had sworn to be better than her violent past. The bell rang before I could respond, shattering the tension like a gunshot. Tyler straightened up slowly, his smile never wavering, as students began gathering their belongings with nervous energy. He had timed his provocation perfectly, pushing me to the breaking point and then backing away before I could retaliate. "Think about what I said, Miss Mitchell," he told me as he collected his backpack. "Think about respect and cooperation and what it takes to earn both." As the classroom emptied, I remained standing behind my desk, hands clenched so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. Tyler Brooks had just declared war, and he had done it in front of witnesses who would spread the story throughout the school within hours. Worse, he had done it with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, that his family's wealth and influence made him immune to consequences. I thought about calling Principal Walsh, but I already knew how that conversation would go. Tyler hadn't technically done anything actionable. He had been disrespectful and intimidating, but he hadn't used profanity or made explicit threats. His behavior could be dismissed as teenage attitude or academic frustration, especially by administrators who were more concerned with maintaining donor relationships than protecting their faculty. That afternoon brought a new level of harassment that made yesterday's parking lot confrontation seem almost civilized by comparison. Someone had broken into my classroom during lunch and rearranged my personal belongings in ways designed to send a message. My coffee mug was shattered on the floor, my family photos were turned face down, and my gradebook was open to Tyler's page with a red pen mark changing his D- to an A+. But the most disturbing discovery was what I found pinned to my bulletin board. A printed photo of me walking to my car the previous day, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from some hidden position. Written across the bottom in red ink were the words, "Teachers who don't cooperate have accidents." The message was unmistakable, and it triggered every threat assessment protocol I had learned during my military service. Tyler Brooks and his friends were no longer content with classroom intimidation. They were escalating to stalking and implicit threats of violence. They were betting that I would be too scared or too professional to respond with anything more than administrative complaints that would disappear into the bureaucratic void. They had badly miscalculated. I spent that evening researching Tyler Brooks and his family with the kind of thoroughness I had once applied to enemy targets. What I found was a pattern of behavior stretching back years. Complaints from previous teachers that had been quietly buried, incidents with other students that had been resolved with financial settlements, and a family history of using wealth and influence to shield their son from consequences. Tyler's father, William Brooks, had built his construction empire through a combination of legitimate business acumen and what could charitably be called aggressive negotiation tactics. There were rumors of union disputes that had been resolved through intimidation rather than bargaining, and at least 2 former business partners had filed restraining orders that had mysteriously disappeared from public records. His mother, Catherine Brooks, was a former beauty queen who had parlayed her looks into a successful real estate career and a seat on several charitable boards. She was known for her sharp tongue and her ability to destroy reputations through carefully placed gossip and social pressure. Together, the Brooks family represented everything I had grown to hate about places like Riverside: wealth without accountability, privilege without responsibility. But my research also revealed something that Tyler probably didn't want widely known. Despite his family's wealth and influence, his grades and test scores were mediocre at best. He was coasting through Riverside on name recognition and family donations, counting on his father's connections to secure him a place at an elite university regardless of his academic performance. That knowledge gave me leverage, but it also made the situation more dangerous. Tyler's harassment wasn't just about power and control. It was about protecting a carefully constructed image that hid his academic inadequacy. A teacher who refused to inflate his grades represented a threat to his entire future, which made him exponentially more dangerous than a simple bully. The next morning brought fresh evidence of escalation that confirmed my worst fears about where this conflict was heading. My car had been vandalized overnight, with all 4 tires slashed and bitch keyed into the paint on the driver's side door. The damage was extensive enough to require a tow truck and several $100s in repairs that I couldn't afford, but not serious enough to warrant more than a brief police report that would probably disappear into the same void as Tyler's previous infractions. I called a taxi to get to school, arriving just in time for first period with my nerves on edge and my patience wearing dangerously thin. The hallway whispers stopped when I passed, replaced by meaningful looks and barely suppressed excitement. Word of my conflict with Tyler had spread through the student body like wildfire, turning our professional disagreement into the kind of high school drama that everyone wanted to witness firsthand. Lisa Thompson cornered me before second period, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration that told me she had heard about the car vandalism. "Sarah, this has gone too far. You need to file a formal complaint with the administration. With what proof? I replied, adjusting my cardigan to hide the stress-induced tremor in my hands. Tyler wasn't exactly careless enough to leave fingerprints or sign his name. Everyone knows it was him, Lisa insisted. His reputation precedes him. Principal Walsh has to take this seriously. But we both knew that wasn't true. Principal Walsh's primary concern was maintaining the delicate balance between academic standards and donor satisfaction, and Tyler's family represented too much financial support to alienate over what could be dismissed as a personality conflict with a replaceable teacher. "I'll handle it," I said, meaning it in ways that Lisa couldn't possibly understand. Tyler Brooks is about to learn that some people don't respond to intimidation the way he expects. Second period arrived with the inevitability of an approaching storm, and Tyler entered my classroom with the swagger of someone who believed he had already won. Marcus and Dylan flanked him as usual. But today they were joined by two other members of Tyler's inner circle, Jake Morrison and Brett Sullivan, both football players with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never facing real consequences for their actions. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," Tyler said with exaggerated politeness. "I heard you had some car trouble." "That's such a shame." The barely concealed satisfaction in his voice confirmed what I already knew, but it also revealed something else. Tyler was getting sloppy, too confident in his immunity to maintain proper operational security. He was making mistakes that would have gotten him killed in the world I used to inhabit. "Good morning, class," I replied neutrally, refusing to give him the reaction he was seeking. "Please take out your copies of Hamlet. We're continuing our discussion of Act 3. But Tyler had apparently decided that yesterday's classroom confrontation was just the opening act of a much larger performance. He stood up immediately, making no pretense of interest in the assigned reading. "Actually, Miss Mitchell, I think we need to finish our conversation about respect and cooperation. You remember our conversation, don't you?" His friends laughed appreciatively, clearly enjoying the show their leader was putting on for their benefit. The other students shifted nervously in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years to come. "Sit down, Tyler," I said firmly. "We're here to discuss Shakespeare, not to continue personal disagreements." "Personal disagreements?" Tyler repeated with mock hurt. "Miss Mitchell, I think you're misunderstanding my intentions. I'm just trying to help you understand how things work at Riverside. Trying to help you succeed as a teacher." He began walking toward my desk again, but this time his approach felt different, more predatory, more certain of the outcome. His friends had positioned themselves strategically around the classroom, blocking potential exit routes and creating a sense of encirclement that triggered every survival instinct I possessed. "You see," Tyler continued conversationally, "successful teachers at Riverside understand the importance of cooperation. They understand that some students deserve special consideration because of their contributions to the school community." He stopped directly in front of my desk, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. The position was calculated to emphasize his height advantage and make me feel small and vulnerable, but it also put him within striking distance if I chose to act on the tactical opportunities his proximity created. "The question is," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting, "are you ready to cooperate, Miss Mitchell? Or do we need to continue these educational conversations until you understand your place here?" The threat was explicit now, delivered in front of multiple witnesses who would spread the story throughout the school within hours. Tyler had crossed every line of professional behavior and was betting that my commitment to nonviolence would protect him from any meaningful consequences. He had made a critical error in judgment that would cost him everything. What happened next unfolded with the systematic precision of a military campaign, except Tyler Brooks had no idea he was declaring war on someone who actually understood warfare. Over the following 2 weeks, his harassment evolved from crude intimidation into something that resembled psychological operations, complete with coordinated attacks designed to isolate me from potential allies and break down my resistance through sustained pressure. The campaign began with social media warfare that would have impressed actual intelligence operatives. Fake Instagram accounts appeared overnight, posting carefully edited photos of me with captions that questioned my competence, my appearance, and my right to teach at an elite institution like Riverside. The images were skillfully manipulated to make me look disheveled or angry, paired with comments that painted me as an unstable teacher who had it out for successful students. Dylan Chin had clearly been busy with his phone and his editing software, creating a narrative that portrayed Tyler as the victim of an unreasonable educator who couldn't handle the academic standards expected at Riverside. The posts were shared widely among the student body, creating a perception that I was the aggressor in our conflict rather than the target of sustained harassment. But the digital assault was just the beginning. Tyler had recruited additional allies from the football team and the wealthy elite, who formed Riverside's social hierarchy. These weren't just teenage bullies anymore. These were young men who understood power dynamics and knew how to weaponize their privilege in ways that left no obvious fingerprints. My morning routine became an exercise in psychological endurance. Someone had obtained my schedule and used it to orchestrate a series of seemingly random encounters that were anything but coincidental. I would find Tyler's crew stationed at strategic locations throughout my day, outside the faculty lounge when I arrived for coffee, in the hallway outside my classroom between periods, in the parking lot when I left for lunch. They never did anything overtly threatening in these encounters. Instead, they perfected the art of legal intimidation, standing just close enough to violate my personal space while maintaining plausible deniability. They would engage in loud conversations about teachers who didn't understand their place, about the importance of family connections in academic success, about what happened to people who challenged the natural order at institutions like Riverside. The psychological pressure was relentless and expertly applied. Every time I turned a corner, I encountered hostile faces and meaningful glares. Every time I tried to eat lunch in peace, I found myself surrounded by whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I looked up. Every time I walked to my car, I discovered new evidence of petty vandalism. Scratches in the paint, salt in the gas tank, windshield wipers bent at impossible angles. Principal Walsh remained conspicuously absent from these developments, despite multiple requests for meetings that were postponed or canceled at the last minute. His assistant, a nervous woman named Carol Henderson, offered increasingly elaborate excuses about his busy schedule and the demands of running an institution as prestigious as Riverside. The message was clear. I was on my own, facing an opponent with institutional protection and unlimited resources. The harassment expanded beyond the school grounds with a sophistication that revealed Tyler's family connections and resources. I began receiving calls at home from telemarketers who somehow had detailed information about my financial situation, my military service, and my mother's medical condition. The calls came at all hours, delivered by voices that expressed concern for my well-being while making it clear that they knew intimate details about my private life. My apartment building manager informed me that complaints had been filed about noise and disturbances that I hadn't caused, suggesting that someone was systematically attempting to create problems with my housing situation. My car insurance company received anonymous reports about my driving that triggered a review of my policy rates. Even my bank called to verify suspicious activity on my account that turned out to be legitimate transactions that someone had reported as potentially fraudulent. The campaign was designed to create chaos in every aspect of my life, while maintaining the illusion that everything was coincidental. Tyler and his allies were betting that the accumulated stress would break me down psychologically and force me to either resign or capitulate to their demands for preferential treatment. They had underestimated both my tolerance for pressure and my ability to recognize coordinated psychological warfare when I encountered it. Every move they made revealed more about their capabilities, their resources, and their tactical preferences. They were operating with the arrogance of people who had never faced real opposition, making mistakes that would have been fatal in actual combat situations. The escalation reached a new level during the third week of October, when Tyler decided that subtle pressure wasn't producing results quickly enough. He began appearing at locations outside school where he had no legitimate reason to be: the grocery store where I shopped, the coffee house where I sometimes graded papers, the medical office where I took my mother for her appointments. These encounters were carefully choreographed to appear coincidental, while sending the unmistakable message that nowhere was safe from his attention. Tyler would express surprise at seeing me, make polite conversation that carried subtle threats, and leave me with the understanding that he could reach me anywhere, anytime he chose. The most disturbing incident occurred on a Saturday morning when I emerged from my apartment to find Tyler sitting in his expensive BMW in the visitor parking area, making no attempt to hide his presence. When I approached my car, he rolled down his window and offered a smile that made my skin crawl. "Good morning, Miss Mitchell," he said with the kind of cheerful tone that people use to discuss the weather. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" perfect for taking care of personal business. The emphasis on personal business was unmistakable, as was the implication that he knew my weekend routines well enough to intercept me at will. I kept walking toward my car, keys already in hand, while my mind automatically assessed escape routes and tactical options. "You know," Tyler continued, raising his voice slightly to ensure I could hear him clearly, "I've been thinking about our conversations at school, about cooperation and mutual respect. I think there might be ways we could resolve our differences that would benefit everyone involved." I reached my car and turned to face him, meeting his gaze with the kind of steady calm I had learned in situations far more dangerous than this one. "Tyler, you need to leave, now." His smile widened, but there was nothing pleasant about the expression. "Oh, but Miss Mitchell, this is a public parking area. I have every right to be here. Just like you have every right to reconsider your position on academic standards and teacher-student relationships." The phrase, teacher-student relationships, carried implications that made my blood run cold. Tyler was escalating from intimidation to something that bordered on sexual harassment, testing boundaries with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. "This conversation is over," I said firmly, opening my car door and preparing to leave. But Tyler wasn't finished. He got out of his BMW with deliberate slowness, his athletic frame moving with predatory confidence as he approached my car. "Actually, Miss Mitchell, I think this conversation is just getting started. See, the thing about conversations is that they require participation from both parties." He placed his hand on my car door, preventing me from closing it, while positioning himself close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the cold calculation in his eyes. The position was a classic intimidation tactic, designed to make me feel trapped while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. "Move your hand," I said quietly, my voice carrying a warning that Tyler either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. "In a minute," he replied, leaning closer until his face was only inches from mine. "First, I want to make sure you understand something important. Teachers at Riverside who don't cooperate with their students often find themselves facing complications. Problems with their employment, their housing, their family situations. It would be such a shame if you experienced those kinds of difficulties." The threat was explicit now, delivered with the confidence of someone who had successfully intimidated others into submission. Tyler was betting that I would be too scared or too professional to respond with anything more than complaints to administrators who had already demonstrated their unwillingness to challenge his family's influence. "Remove your hand from my car," I repeated, letting a hint of authority creep into my voice for the first time since our conflict began. "This is your final warning." Tyler laughed, but the sound had a sharp edge that revealed his growing frustration with my refusal to submit. "Final warning? That sounds almost threatening, Miss Mitchell. Are you threatening a student? Because that could be a serious problem for your career." He leaned even closer, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered words that crossed every line of acceptable behavior. "Maybe what you need is a lesson in proper respect. Maybe you need to understand what happens to teachers who forget their place." That was when something snapped inside me that had been held in check for 3 years. Tyler Brooks had just made the kind of mistake that got people seriously injured in the world I used to inhabit, and my military training responded before my civilian restraint could override it. My left hand shot up to grip his wrist with crushing force, applying pressure to nerve clusters that could disable an opponent in seconds. Tyler's eyes widened in shock and pain as he felt the iron strength hidden beneath my soft appearance, but before either of us could escalate further, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted our confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly neighbor who lived on the ground floor, emerged from the building's main entrance with her small dog on a leash. The sight of witnesses caused both Tyler and me to step back from the precipice of violence, though the promise of future conflict hung in the air between us like smoke from a recent explosion. "Everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her sharp eyes taking in Tyler's expensive car and obvious youth with the kind of suspicion that came from decades of observing human behavior. "Everything's fine," I replied, releasing Tyler's wrist and stepping away from my car. Tyler was just leaving. Tyler rubbed his wrist where my grip had left red marks, his expression cycling through surprise, anger, and what might have been a grudging respect for the strength I had just demonstrated. For the first time since our conflict began, he looked uncertain. as if he was reassessing his assumptions about the quiet teacher he had dismissed as an easy target. "This isn't over," he said quietly, getting back into his BMW with movements that suggested he was fighting to maintain his composure. "This is just the beginning." As he drove away, I realized that our weekend encounter had fundamentally changed the nature of our conflict. Tyler had seen proof that I wasn't the helpless victim he had assumed, which made me infinitely more dangerous to his sense of invulnerability. But it also made him more determined to prove his dominance, to find ways to break me that didn't involve direct physical confrontation where I might have advantages he hadn't anticipated. The following Monday brought a new phase of harassment that revealed just how seriously Tyler was taking our escalating conflict. He had apparently spent the weekend planning a coordinated assault on my professional reputation that would either force my resignation or create grounds for my termination. The campaign began before I even reached my classroom. Principal Walsh was waiting in the hallway outside room 204B with an expression of barely contained irritation and a manila folder that probably contained complaints about my teaching methods, my professional conduct, or both. "Miss Mitchell," he said without preamble, "we need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to my attention regarding your classroom management and your interactions with students." The formal tone and public setting were clearly designed to maximize my embarrassment while sending a message to any students or faculty who might be watching. Tyler had apparently decided that if he couldn't intimidate me into submission, he would use his family's influence to attack my career directly. "Of course, Principal Walsh," I replied calmly, unlocking my classroom door and gesturing for him to enter. "What specific concerns would you like to discuss?" Walsh followed me into the classroom and closed the door behind him, but his body language suggested he wanted this conversation to be as brief and one-sided as possible. He opened the manila folder and pulled out what appeared to be formal complaint letters written on expensive stationery. "I've received multiple reports from students and parents expressing concern about your teaching methods and your treatment of high-achieving students," he said, reading from prepared notes rather than speaking spontaneously. "Specifically, there are allegations that you're showing bias against students from prominent families and creating a hostile learning environment for academically successful pupils." The language was clearly crafted by someone with legal training, probably Tyler's father or the family attorney. Every phrase was designed to create documentation that could support a case for my termination while avoiding any specific accusations that might require actual evidence. "Could you be more specific about these alleged teaching method problems?" I asked, settling into my desk chair with the kind of calm professionalism I had learned during military briefings. "What exactly am I doing that's creating this hostile environment?" Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his position near the door, clearly uncomfortable with having to defend complaints that probably couldn't withstand serious scrutiny. "The reports suggest that you're applying academic standards inconsistently, showing favoritism towards certain students while being unnecessarily harsh with others. I assume you have specific examples of this inconsistent application of standards," I replied, opening my grade book and preparing to defend every assignment, every test score, every evaluation I had recorded. "Because I'm confident that my grading practices will withstand any objective review." That was when Walsh revealed the real purpose of his visit. "Actually, Miss Mitchell, I think it would be best if we could resolve these concerns informally, without the need for formal investigations or documentation that might reflect poorly on everyone involved." The suggestion was a diplomatic way of offering me a deal: change Tyler's grade and modify my teaching approach to accommodate the complaints, and the whole matter would disappear without any permanent record of conflict. It was exactly the kind of corrupt compromise that allowed privileged students to coast through elite institutions without facing real academic accountability. "I'm afraid I can't compromise academic integrity for the sake of avoiding conflict," I said firmly. "Every grade I've assigned has been earned based on objective criteria applied consistently to all students." Walsh's expression hardened as he realized I wasn't going to accept his proposed resolution. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you understand that Riverside Preparatory Academy depends on the support and goodwill of our alumni and donor families. Sometimes that requires a certain degree of flexibility in how we handle situations involving prominent students." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the core message. Tyler's family's money was more important than academic honesty, and teachers who refused to acknowledge that hierarchy would face consequences. Walsh was essentially admitting that the school operated a two-tiered system where wealthy students received preferential treatment in exchange for their family's financial support. "I understand perfectly," I replied, meeting his gaze with steady determination. "And I'm confident that maintaining consistent academic standards serves the long-term interests of both the school and its students better than compromising those standards for short-term donor relations." Walsh closed the manila folder with more force than necessary, his diplomatic facade slipping to reveal genuine frustration. "I hope you'll reconsider your position, Miss Mitchell. These kinds of conflicts rarely end well for faculty members who choose to make them personal battles rather than professional adjustments." The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but it was unmistakably a threat nonetheless. Walsh was giving me one final opportunity to capitulate before Tyler's family escalated their pressure campaign to levels that might threaten my employment directly. "Thank you for bringing these concerns to my attention," I said neutrally. "I'll certainly take them under consideration as I continue to maintain the academic standards that Riverside claims to represent." After Walsh left, I sat alone in my classroom contemplating the impossible position Tyler and his family had maneuvered me into. Capitulating to their demands would compromise everything I believed about education and personal integrity, but continuing to resist would likely cost me the job I needed to support both myself and my mother's medical expenses. That afternoon brought the most sophisticated phase of Tyler's harassment campaign yet, a coordinated effort to isolate me from potential allies among both students and faculty. I discovered that rumors were circulating about my military background, carefully crafted stories that painted me as an unstable veteran who posed a potential danger to the school community. Someone had apparently done extensive research into my service record and discovered details about my deployment that weren't public knowledge. These facts were being combined with deliberate misinformation to create a narrative that questioned my psychological fitness for working with teenagers. The rumors suggested that I had been discharged from the military for disciplinary reasons, rather than completing my service normally. They implied that I had violent tendencies that made me unsuitable for civilian employment, especially in educational settings. Most damaging of all, they insinuated that my conflict with Tyler stemmed from my inability to handle normal classroom challenges without reverting to aggressive behaviors learned during combat. Lisa Thompson approached me after school with an expression of concern that confirmed how widely these stories were spreading. "Sarah, I don't know what's being said about your background, but I wanted you to know that not everyone believes the gossip." "What exactly is being said?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the general outline of Tyler's latest attack on my reputation. Lisa glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard before continuing in a low voice. "There are stories about your military service, about why you left the Army, about whether you're psychologically stable enough to be teaching teenagers. It's all very vague and hard to pin down, but it's creating the impression that you might be dangerous." The sophistication of the attack impressed me, despite my anger at its malicious intent. Tyler and his allies had identified my military background as a potential vulnerability and weaponized it with remarkable skill. They were using my service record, something I was proud of, as evidence that I was unfit for civilian employment. "None of it's true," I said simply, though I knew that defending myself against vague insinuations was nearly impossible. "But I appreciate you telling me what's being said." Lisa nodded sympathetically, but I could see uncertainty in her eyes despite her supportive words. The rumors were doing exactly what Tyler intended, creating doubt about my stability and judgment that would make it easier to justify my termination if his other pressure tactics didn't produce the results he wanted. That evening, as I sat in my apartment grading papers and trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine, I received a phone call that marked Tyler's final escalation before our inevitable confrontation. The voice on the other end was electronically distorted, clearly disguised to prevent identification, but the message was crystal clear. "Miss Mitchell," the artificial voice said, "you have 24 hours to reconsider your position regarding certain academic matters. If you continue to be unreasonable, the consequences will extend beyond your professional situation to include people you care about." The threat against my family was the last straw, the final boundary that Tyler had crossed in his campaign to break my resistance. I had endured harassment, intimidation, vandalism, and professional sabotage while maintaining my commitment to nonviolence and civilian restraint. But threatening my elderly mother was a mistake that activated every protective instinct I possessed. "Who is this?" I demanded, though I already knew the answer. "Someone who wants to help you make the right decision," the disguised voice replied. 24 hours, Miss Mitchell. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The line went dead, leaving me alone with the understanding that Tyler Brooks had just declared total war on everything I held dear. He had moved beyond trying to intimidate me into changing his grade. Now he was threatening to destroy my life and endanger the people I loved unless I submitted to his demands completely. I spent that night making preparations that I hadn't needed to consider in 3 years. I called my mother and arranged for her to stay with my aunt in another state until the situation resolved itself. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in employment issues and documented every incident of harassment I could remember. Most importantly, I mentally prepared myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. Tyler Brooks had pushed me to the point where my civilian restraint was about to collide with my military training, and one of those identities was going to give way under the pressure. He had spent weeks systematically destroying my peaceful existence at Riverside, gambling that I would break before I fought back. He was about to discover just how badly he had miscalculated the quiet teacher he had dismissed as weak and vulnerable. Tomorrow would bring our final confrontation, and Tyler was going to learn that some people were far more dangerous than they appeared. The final confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in the underground parking garage beneath Riverside Preparatory Academy, in a location Tyler had chosen specifically because the security cameras had been mysteriously malfunctioning for weeks. What he didn't know was that I had installed my own surveillance system 3 days earlier, hidden cameras purchased with my own money and positioned to capture every angle of the isolated space where I knew our conflict would eventually reach its violent conclusion. Tyler was waiting for me when I emerged from the faculty elevator at 4:30 p.m., flanked by Marcus Rivera, Dylan Chen, Jake Morrison, and Brett Sullivan. 5 athletic teenagers against one supposedly helpless teacher, in a location where no one would witness whatever they had planned. The setup revealed both Tyler's confidence in his physical dominance and his complete misunderstanding of who he was actually confronting. "Miss Mitchell," Tyler called out with mock cheerfulness, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the nearly empty garage. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing your 24-hour deadline, and it seems like time's up." I continued walking toward my car, keys in hand, while my mind automatically assessed the tactical situation. 5 opponents positioned in a loose semicircle, blocking my direct path to the vehicle while leaving themselves room to maneuver. Tyler in the center, clearly the leader and primary threat. Marcus and Dylan flanking him, both nervous but committed to following their leader's instructions. Jake and Brett positioned to cut off potential escape routes, their body language suggesting they expected this to be easy. "I told you yesterday that our conversation was over," I said calmly, continuing my measured approach despite the obvious trap they had set for me. "Nothing has changed since then." Tyler laughed, but the sound carried an edge of frustrated anger that revealed how much my continued resistance had affected him. "Oh, but Miss Mitchell, everything has changed. See, we've been patient with you. We've been understanding about your adjustment period at Riverside, but patience has limits, and yours just expired." He stepped forward, his movement triggering a corresponding shift from his allies as they tightened their formation around me. The coordination was impressive for amateurs, but it also revealed their tactical inexperience. They were thinking like bullies rather than fighters, focused on intimidation rather than actual combat effectiveness. "What we're going to do," Tyler continued, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper that was supposed to be threatening, "is help you understand your proper place in the Riverside community. Help you learn the kind of respect that your military training apparently never taught you." The reference to my service record confirmed that Tyler's research into my background had been extensive, but it also revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of what that training actually meant. He thought military service was about following orders and showing deference to authority, not about tactical thinking and lethal force application. "Step aside," I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the fear or submission Tyler expected to hear. "This doesn't have to escalate beyond what it already has." "Oh, but it does," Tyler replied, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone. "See, we're going to document this educational session. Show everyone at Riverside exactly what happens to teachers who forget their place." Dylan already had his camera ready, positioned to capture whatever humiliation Tyler had planned from the best possible angle. The intent was clear. They planned to strip away not just my physical dignity but my professional reputation, creating visual evidence that would destroy my career, even if I somehow survived the immediate assault. "Last chance to cooperate voluntarily," Tyler said, his smile revealing the predatory satisfaction of someone who believed he had already won. "Take off that ridiculous cardigan and show us what the scared little teacher is really hiding underneath." The demand was delivered with the confidence of someone who had never encountered real resistance, who had spent his entire life watching others submit to his family's wealth and influence. Tyler genuinely believed that I would comply rather than face whatever consequences he was prepared to impose. Instead, I set down my briefcase and slowly removed my cardigan, folding it carefully and placing it on the hood of a nearby car. The action revealed the lean muscle definition that my oversized clothing had been designed to conceal, the physical evidence of years of intensive training that Tyler had dismissed as irrelevant to civilian confrontations. "Very good," Tyler said approvingly, apparently interpreting my compliance as the beginning of total submission. "Now the blouse. Let's see what other secrets you've been hiding under all those modest teacher clothes." That was when I looked directly into Dylan's camera and spoke clearly enough for the microphone to capture every word. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces. I am being sexually assaulted by 5 students from Riverside Preparatory Academy in the school's parking garage. What you are about to witness is lawful self-defense against multiple attackers." Tyler's expression shifted from predatory confidence to confused anger as he realized that his documentation strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating evidence of my humiliation, Dylan's camera was now recording a clear statement of criminal intent and my legal justification for whatever followed. "Shut her up," Tyler snarled, lunging forward with his hands extended toward my throat. That was his final mistake. My left hand intercepted his reaching arms with mechanical precision, fingers closing around his right wrist in a grip that immediately compromised his balance and leverage. My right hand shot up to his throat, not to crush his windpipe but to apply pressure to the carotid artery that would restrict blood flow to his brain. Tyler's eyes widened in shock as he felt the iron strength hidden beneath my soft exterior, but by then it was already too late for him to adjust his tactics. I pivoted on my left foot, using Tyler's forward momentum against him as I executed a textbook hip throw that sent all 6 feet and 200 pounds of him crashing into the concrete floor with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The technique was controlled and precise, designed to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. But Tyler's impact with the unforgiving concrete was still devastating enough to leave him gasping and disoriented. Marcus moved next, probably acting on instinct rather than conscious decision as he saw his leader go down. He approached from my left side with his fists raised in what looked like a boxing stance, clearly expecting a traditional fight rather than the systematic dismantling he was about to experience. I caught his lead hand as it approached my face, twisted it backward past his wrist's natural range of motion, and applied downward pressure that forced him to his knees to avoid a fracture. While he was focused on the pain radiating from his hyperextended joint, I used my free hand to strike a nerve cluster just below his ear that instantly shut down his motor control and sent him sprawling unconscious beside his still gasping leader. Dylan and Jake hesitated, suddenly realizing that their easy target was systematically destroying their group with techniques they didn't recognize or understand. I could see the calculation in their eyes as they weighed their loyalty to Tyler against their growing understanding that this confrontation was not going according to plan. "You can leave now," I told them calmly, straightening my blouse and checking to make sure Tyler was still breathing normally despite his obvious disorientation. "This doesn't have to involve anyone else." But Brett Sullivan, apparently convinced that his size advantage would be decisive, charged at me with the kind of reckless aggression that got people seriously injured in real fights. He outweighed me by at least 60 pounds, and probably expected his football training to be sufficient against a woman he still saw as a helpless teacher. I sidestepped his charge with minimal effort, letting his momentum carry him past me while I drove an elbow into his kidney with enough force to drop him to his hands and knees. Before he could recover, I applied a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to his brain, maintaining pressure until his struggling ceased and he went limp in my arms. Jake and Dylan backed away with expressions of pure terror, finally understanding that they were witnessing something far beyond normal human conflict. Instead, I set down my briefcase and slowly removed my cardigan, folding it carefully and placing it on the hood of a nearby car. The action revealed the lean muscle definition that my oversized clothing had been designed to conceal, the physical evidence of years of intensive training that Tyler had dismissed as irrelevant to civilian confrontations. "Very good," Tyler said approvingly, apparently interpreting my compliance as the beginning of total submission. Now the blouse. Let's see what other secrets you've been hiding under all those modest teacher clothes. That was when I looked directly into Dylan's camera and spoke clearly enough for the microphone to capture every word. My name is Sarah Mitchell, former Staff Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces. I am being sexually assaulted by 5 students from Riverside Preparatory Academy in the school's parking garage. What you're about to witness is lawful self-defense against multiple attackers. Tyler's expression shifted from predatory confidence to confused anger as he realized that his documentation strategy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating evidence of my humiliation, Dylan's camera was now recording a clear statement of criminal intent and my legal justification for whatever followed. "Shut her up," Tyler snarled, lunging forward with his hands extended toward my throat. That was his final mistake. My left hand intercepted his reaching arms with mechanical precision, fingers closing around his right wrist in a grip that immediately compromised his balance and leverage. My right hand shot up to his throat, not to crush his windpipe but to apply pressure to the carotid artery that would restrict blood flow to his brain. Tyler's eyes widened in shock as he felt the iron strength hidden beneath my soft exterior. But by then, it was already too late for him to adjust his tactics. I pivoted on my left foot, using Tyler's forward momentum against him as I executed a textbook hip throw that sent all 6 feet and 200 pounds of him crashing into the concrete floor with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. The technique was controlled and precise, designed to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage, but Tyler's impact with the unforgiving concrete was still devastating enough to leave him gasping and disoriented. Marcus moved next, probably acting on instinct rather than conscious decision as he saw his leader go down. He approached from my left side with his fists raised in what looked like a boxing stance, clearly expecting a traditional fight rather than the systematic dismantling he was about to experience. I caught his lead hand as it approached my face, twisted it backward past his wrist's natural range of motion, and applied downward pressure that forced him to his knees to avoid a fracture. While he was focused on the pain radiating from his hyperextended joint, I used my free hand to strike a nerve cluster just below his ear that instantly shut down his motor control and sent him sprawling unconscious beside his still gasping leader. Dylan and Jake hesitated, suddenly realizing that their easy target was systematically destroying their group with techniques they didn't recognize or understand. I could see the calculation in their eyes as they weighed their loyalty to Tyler against their growing understanding that this confrontation was not going according to plan. "You can leave now," I told them calmly, straightening my blouse and checking to make sure Tyler was still breathing normally despite his obvious disorientation. "This doesn't have to involve anyone else." But Brett Sullivan, apparently convinced that his size advantage would be decisive, charged at me with the kind of reckless aggression that got people seriously injured in real fights. He outweighed me by at least 60 pounds, and probably expected his football training to be sufficient against a woman he still saw as a helpless teacher. I sidestepped his charge with minimal effort, letting his momentum carry him past me while I drove an elbow into his kidney with enough force to drop him to his hands and knees. Before he could recover, I applied a sleeper hold that cut off blood flow to his brain, maintaining pressure until his struggling ceased and he went limp in my arms. Jake and Dylan backed away with expressions of pure terror, finally understanding that they were witnessing something far beyond normal human conflict. "What was your specialty?" "Special Forces," I replied. "Close quarters combat, tactical operations, personal protection. 6 years active duty. Honorably discharged 3 years ago." Rodriguez nodded appreciatively. "That explains the technique. Clean, controlled, minimal force necessary to neutralize the threats. This is textbook self-defense against multiple attackers." Tyler attempted to interrupt from where he sat receiving medical attention, his voice still weak but filled with desperate anger. "She's lying. She attacked us for no reason. We were just talking to her." "Mr. Brooks," Rodriguez said with professional patience, "the video clearly shows you demanding that this woman remove her clothing after cornering her in an isolated location with 4 other males. That's attempted sexual assault under Connecticut law, regardless of your family's social position." The arrival of Principal Walsh and William Brooks Sr. created a new dynamic that revealed just how extensively Tyler's family had protected him from consequences throughout his life. Brooks Sr. immediately began making demands and threats, apparently expecting his wealth and influence to make the criminal charges disappear through familiar channels. Detective Rodriguez, Brooks Sr. said with the kind of commanding tone he probably used in business negotiations, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding here. My son is an honor student who would never engage in the kind of behavior you're suggesting." "Mr. Brooks," Rodriguez replied evenly, "we have video evidence of your son explicitly demanding that this woman remove her clothing, followed by physical assault when she refused. There's no misunderstanding about what happened here." Brooks Sr.'s expression shifted from commanding confidence to barely contained rage, as he realized that his usual methods of problem resolution weren't going to work in this situation. "That video was taken without consent. It's inadmissible." "Actually, sir, your son's associate recorded the video with the apparent intent of documenting what they planned to do to Miss Mitchell. The legality of the recording is quite clear under Connecticut law." Principal Walsh attempted a different approach, focusing on institutional damage control rather than legal defense. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm sure we can handle this matter internally through appropriate disciplinary channels. There's no need to involve the criminal justice system in what amounts to a student-teacher conflict." Principal Walsh, Rodriguez said with the kind of firm patience that suggested he had dealt with similar administrative interference before, "Attempted sexual assault isn't a disciplinary matter. It's a felony." 5 young men cornered a woman in an isolated location and attempted to force her to remove her clothing. The only reason this didn't become a much more serious crime is that Miss Mitchell had the training and capability to defend herself. The next several hours involved extensive interviews, evidence collection, and legal procedures that gradually revealed the full scope of Tyler's harassment campaign. My hidden cameras in the parking garage provided additional angles that corroborated the phone video, while my documentation of previous incidents established a clear pattern of escalating criminal behavior. Detective Rodriguez's investigation uncovered digital evidence that connected Tyler and his associates to the social media harassment, the vandalism of my car, the anonymous threatening phone calls, and even the attempted manipulation of my housing and financial situations. What had seemed like a series of unfortunate coincidences was revealed to be a coordinated campaign of criminal harassment orchestrated by wealthy teenagers who believed their privilege made them untouchable. "Miss Mitchell," Rodriguez told me as the investigation progressed, "you should know that this case is going to trial. The evidence is overwhelming, and the prosecutor's office takes sexual assault very seriously, regardless of the defendant's family connections." Tyler's arrest, along with Marcus, Brett, Jake, and Dylan, sent shockwaves through Riverside Preparatory Academy and the broader Millbrook Valley community. The idea that wealthy, privileged students could face real consequences for criminal behavior was apparently unprecedented in the insular world of elite private education. The trial, which took place 6 months later, became a local sensation that attracted media attention throughout Connecticut and beyond. The video evidence was devastating to the defense, clearly showing Tyler's attempted sexual assault and my measured response designed to neutralize the threat with minimal necessary force. Dr. Elizabeth Harrison, an expert in military combat training, testified about the restraint I had shown in using only the minimum force necessary to stop 5 attackers who significantly outweighed me. Miss Mitchell could have caused permanent injury or death to any of these young men, Dr. Harrison explained to the jury. The fact that she chose techniques designed to incapacitate rather than permanently harm demonstrates remarkable professional discipline under extreme stress. Tyler's defense attorney attempted to portray me as an unstable veteran who had overreacted to normal teenage behavior, but the video evidence made that narrative impossible to sustain. The jury could see exactly what had happened, hear Tyler's explicit demands, and witness my clear attempt to de-escalate before defending myself. The verdict was unanimous. Tyler Brooks was convicted of attempted sexual assault, criminal harassment, and conspiracy. Marcus Rivera, Brett Sullivan, Jake Morrison, and Dylan Chen received lesser convictions for their roles in the conspiracy, but all 5 faced serious legal consequences that would follow them for the rest of their lives. More importantly, the trial exposed the systemic corruption that had allowed Tyler's behavior to continue unchecked for years. The revelation that Riverside Preparatory Academy had deliberately ignored criminal behavior by wealthy students triggered a state investigation that resulted in significant administrative changes and the implementation of actual accountability measures. Principal Walsh was terminated for his failure to address the harassment campaign, replaced by an administrator with a background in student safety and legal compliance. The school board implemented new policies that explicitly prohibited preferential treatment based on family donations, creating systems that prioritize student-faculty safety over donor relations. I returned to teaching at Riverside after the trial, but my role had fundamentally changed. The quiet, invisible teacher, who had tried to blend into the background, was gone, replaced by someone who had proven that strength came in many forms, and that standing up to injustice was worth the personal cost. My classroom became a sanctuary for students who had previously felt powerless against bullying and harassment. I started an after-school program focused on conflict resolution and personal safety, teaching young people that they didn't have to accept abuse from anyone regardless of wealth, social position, or institutional protection. The program attracted students from across the school, including some who had previously been part of Tyler's social circle but had never felt safe challenging his behavior. They learned that courage wasn't about being physically strong or socially powerful. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the personal cost seemed overwhelming. Lisa Thompson, who had become a close friend and ally during the legal proceedings, helped me develop a curriculum that combined academic learning with practical life skills. We taught students to recognize manipulation and intimidation tactics, to document harassment when it occurred, and to seek help from appropriate authorities rather than suffering in silence. "You know what I admire most about what you did?" Lisa told me one afternoon as we watched students practice conflict de-escalation techniques. "You didn't become violent because you enjoyed it. You used force because it was necessary to protect yourself, and then you stopped the moment the threat was neutralized." Her observation touched on something that had taken me months to fully understand about my own actions that day in the parking garage. I hadn't abandoned my commitment to peace and nonviolence. I had simply learned that sometimes protecting yourself and others required making difficult choices about when and how to apply force. The legal victory and institutional changes were satisfying, but the real transformation occurred in the relationships I built with students who had previously felt hopeless about their ability to change toxic social dynamics. Young people who had been victims of harassment found their voices and learned to advocate for themselves and others. Rebecca Chen, no relation to Dylan, was a sophomore who had been targeted by a group of junior boys who thought her quiet demeanor made her an easy victim. She came to my classroom after school one day with bruises on her arms and a story about harassment that sounded depressingly familiar. "Miss Mitchell," she said hesitantly, "I heard about what happened with Tyler Brooks, how you stood up to him even though everyone said he was untouchable. I was wondering, could you teach me how to do that?" "Rebecca," I replied, gesturing for her to sit down in the comfortable chair I kept beside my desk for exactly these kinds of conversations. "Standing up to bullies isn't about fighting. It's about understanding your own worth and refusing to let anyone convince you that you deserve to be treated badly." Over the following weeks, I worked with Rebecca to document the harassment she was experiencing, to identify trusted adults who could provide support, and to develop strategies for responding to intimidation that didn't require physical confrontation. More importantly, I helped her understand that seeking help wasn't weakness. It was intelligent, tactical thinking. The boys who had been harassing Rebecca faced swift disciplinary action under the new policies implemented after Tyler's conviction. But more significantly, Rebecca's willingness to speak up encouraged other students to report similar incidents, creating a cultural shift that made harassment less tolerable throughout the school community. "I used to think that being quiet and invisible was the safest way to get through high school," Rebecca told me months later, after the boys who had targeted her were facing suspension and mandatory counseling. "But you showed me that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to defend yourself." Her words crystallized something important about the lessons I had learned through my confrontation with Tyler Brooks. For 3 years, I had tried to hide from my military training and the violent capabilities it represented, believing that suppressing that part of myself would make me a better person and a more effective teacher. But the reality was more complex than that simplistic narrative. My military background hadn't made me violent or dangerous. It had given me tools that could be used constructively or destructively, depending on the circumstances and my own moral choices. The key was knowing when and how to apply those tools in service of protecting myself and others. The woman who had emerged from that parking garage confrontation was neither the helpless victim Tyler had expected nor the uncontrolled weapon I had feared becoming. She was someone who understood that true strength came from the wisdom to know when force was necessary and the discipline to use only as much as the situation required. Today, 5 years after that confrontation, I still teach at Riverside Preparatory Academy, but the school has become a very different place. The culture of impunity that once protected wealthy bullies has been replaced by systems that prioritize safety, accountability, and genuine academic achievement over social connections and family donations. Tyler Brooks served 18 months in juvenile detention, followed by 5 years of probation and mandatory counseling. His college applications were rejected by every elite institution he had planned to attend, and he eventually enrolled in a community college where he was required to take courses on ethics and conflict resolution. Marcus Rivera, Brett Sullivan, Jake Morrison, and Dylan Chen faced varying degrees of legal and social consequences, but all of them eventually found ways to rebuild their lives around more positive choices. Several of them later reached out to apologize for their involvement in the harassment campaign, acknowledging that they had been following a leader whose values they should have questioned. The most surprising development came 3 years after the trial, when Dylan Chen enrolled in my conflict resolution class as a college freshman taking courses at Riverside through a community partnership program. He had changed dramatically from the teenager who had filmed Tyler's assault, becoming someone genuinely committed to understanding and preventing the kind of behavior he had once enabled. "Miss Mitchell," he said after class one day, "I know this might sound strange, but I wanted to thank you for what you did that day in the parking garage. Not just defending yourself, but showing all of us that actions have consequences. I needed to learn that lesson, even though it was painful." His apology was sincere and reflected genuine personal growth, but it also reminded me that the impact of standing up to bullying extended far beyond the immediate participants. The students who witnessed Tyler's downfall, who saw that wealth and privilege couldn't protect him from the consequences of criminal behavior, learned lessons about justice and accountability that would influence their own choices for years to come. My mother, who had been frightened by the threats against our family but proud of my decision to fight back, moved back to Connecticut after the trial concluded. She often visited my classroom and marveled at the confident, engaged students who participated in our conflict resolution programs. "You know," she told me recently, "I used to worry that your military training would make it hard for you to adjust to civilian life. I never imagined that those same skills would make you a better teacher and help so many young people learn to stand up for themselves." Her observation captured something essential about the journey I had taken from soldier to teacher to advocate. Each phase of my life had built on the previous one, creating a person who could draw on diverse experiences to help others navigate challenges and find their own sources of strength. The conflict resolution program I developed at Riverside has since been adopted by other schools throughout Connecticut, creating a network of educators who understand that preventing bullying requires more than just policies and procedures. It requires adults who are willing to model courage, students who are empowered to speak up, and communities that prioritize safety over social status. Standing in my classroom today, watching students practice the skills that will help them navigate conflicts throughout their lives, I realized that my confrontation with Tyler Brooks wasn't really about combat techniques or military training. It was about the fundamental choice between accepting injustice and fighting for what's right, even when the personal cost seems overwhelming. Every person has moments when they must choose between safety and principle, between hiding and standing up, between accepting abuse and defending themselves. The specific skills that enable resistance matter less than the willingness to use whatever capabilities you possess in service of protecting yourself and others who cannot protect themselves. Tyler Brooks taught me that predators exist in every environment, that wealth and privilege can shield criminal behavior, and that institutional corruption often protects the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. But he also taught me that standing up to injustice, even when it seems impossible, can create ripple effects that transform entire communities. The quiet teacher who tried to hide from her past has been replaced by someone who understands that true strength comes not from avoiding conflict, but from knowing when and how to engage it constructively. Every day, I help students discover their own sources of power and learn to use them wisely. That's the real lesson of what happened in that parking garage 5 years ago. Not that violence is the answer to every problem, but that refusing to defend yourself and others is sometimes the most violent choice of all. Sometimes the most peaceful thing you can do is fight back. The most unexpected consequence of my confrontation with Tyler Brooks didn't emerge until 2 years after the trial, when I received a letter from someone I had never met, but whose life had been changed by the story that had spread far beyond the walls of Riverside Preparatory Academy. Maria Santos was a high school teacher in Phoenix, Arizona, who had been enduring harassment from a group of senior students whose parents wielded significant influence in her school district. "Dear Miss Mitchell," her letter began, "I saw the news coverage of your case and watched the video footage that was released during the trial. I wanted you to know that your courage to stand up to those students gave me the strength to document and report similar behavior that I had been suffering in silence for months." Maria's situation had many parallels to my own experience with Tyler. She taught at an elite charter school where wealthy families expected preferential treatment for their children, and she had been targeted by a group of students who resented her refusal to inflate grades and overlook academic dishonesty. The harassment had escalated to property damage, social media attacks, and eventually physical intimidation that the administration had consistently minimized or ignored. "What struck me most about your story," Maria continued, "wasn't the specific self-defense techniques you used, but the way you documented everything and refused to be intimidated into silence. I realized that I had been enabling their behavior by not fighting back through proper channels." Maria had followed my example by systematically documenting each incident of harassment, installing security cameras around her property, and building a comprehensive case that she presented to both school administrators and local law enforcement. When her initial complaints were dismissed or minimized, she escalated to the state education department and eventually to civil rights organizations that specialized in workplace harassment. The result was a federal investigation that uncovered widespread patterns of discrimination and intimidation at her school, leading to administrative changes, policy reforms, and criminal charges against several students who had crossed legal boundaries in their campaign against teachers they perceived as obstacles to their academic entitlement. 6 students are now facing criminal charges, and 4 administrators have been terminated for their failure to address documented harassment, Maria wrote. "More importantly, teachers throughout our district now understand that we don't have to accept abuse just because it comes from wealthy students whose families donate to the school." Her letter was the first of many similar communications I received from educators across the country who had heard about my case and found inspiration to address their own situations involving student harassment, administrative corruption, and institutional protection of privileged bullies. Each story revealed how widespread these problems were and how rarely they were effectively addressed. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to my former principal, was an art teacher in suburban Atlanta who had been targeted by a group of students who resented her diverse curriculum and inclusive classroom policies. The harassment had included racist graffiti, threats against her family, and attempts to get her fired through coordinated complaints from parents who objected to her teaching about artists from different cultural backgrounds. "Your case showed me that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply refuse to be victimized," Jennifer wrote. "I started recording everything, saved every threatening message, and built a case that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as personality conflicts." Jennifer's documentation revealed a pattern of harassment that extended beyond her classroom to include attacks on other teachers who didn't conform to the conservative expectations of certain parent groups. Her evidence led to a Title IX investigation that resulted in significant policy changes and the departure of several administrators who had enabled discriminatory behavior. Dr. Patricia Kim, a science teacher in Portland, Oregon, had been harassed by students who objected to her lessons on evolution and climate change. The campaign against her included vandalism of her laboratory equipment, online attacks questioning her citizenship and qualifications, and eventually physical confrontations that escalated when parents joined their children in targeting her, both at school and in her personal life. Reading about your military background and how you used your training to protect yourself made me realize that my scientific training was also a form of preparation for battle, Patricia wrote. "I started treating the harassment like a research problem, collecting data and building evidence until the pattern became undeniable." Her systematic approach to documentation revealed connections between the harassment she experienced and similar campaigns against other educators who taught subjects that certain groups found ideologically objectionable. The evidence she compiled led to federal civil rights charges and significant legal settlements that changed how her district handled ideologically motivated harassment. These letters and many others revealed that my confrontation with Tyler Brooks had become something larger than a single incident of workplace harassment. It had evolved into a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption and a blueprint for how targeted individuals could fight back against coordinated campaigns of intimidation. The common threads in these stories were striking. In each case, the harassment had been systematic and coordinated, designed to isolate targets and break down their resistance through sustained psychological pressure. In each case, school administrators had initially minimized or ignored the problems, often prioritizing the comfort of wealthy donors over the safety of their employees. And in each case, the targeted teachers had found strength and tactical guidance in my example of documentation, escalation, and refusal to be silenced. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the detective who had investigated my case, reached out to me 3 years after the trial with a proposal that would formalize the network of educators who had been inspired by my story. He had left the police force to work with the Department of Education on developing protocols for investigating harassment in educational settings, and he wanted my input on training programs for administrators and law enforcement officers. Your case has become a textbook example of how to properly investigate and prosecute harassment in academic environments, Dr. Rodriguez explained during our meeting. But more importantly, it's shown how individual courage can spark institutional change when the right support systems are in place. The training program we developed together focused on recognizing the warning signs of coordinated harassment campaigns, understanding the legal frameworks that protected both students and educators, and implementing intervention strategies that prioritized safety while respecting due process rights. We taught administrators how to distinguish between isolated conflicts and systematic intimidation, and we showed law enforcement officers how to gather evidence in environments where witnesses might be reluctant to come forward. The program was initially piloted in Connecticut schools, but it quickly expanded to other states as educators and administrators recognized the need for better tools to address harassment and intimidation. The curriculum included case studies from my experience and the stories of other teachers who had successfully fought back against coordinated campaigns of abuse. Lisa Thompson, who had become my closest colleague and collaborator, developed the conflict resolution components of the training program. Her background in physical education gave her unique insights into how power dynamics played out in school environments, and her natural empathy made her exceptionally effective at helping traumatized educators rebuild their confidence and professional effectiveness. What I've learned from working with Sarah and the teachers who've reached out to her, Lisa told participants in one of our training sessions, is that harassment campaigns succeed when targets feel isolated and helpless. Our job as educators and administrators is to make sure that never happens, that every member of our community knows they have support and resources when they face intimidation. The training program evolved to include modules on recognizing different types of harassment, from traditional bullying to sophisticated psychological warfare tactics employed by students who had access to significant resources and family influence. We taught participants how to identify coordinated campaigns, document evidence effectively, and escalate complaints through appropriate channels when initial responses were inadequate. One of the most valuable aspects of the program was connecting current harassment targets with others who had successfully navigated similar situations. The network of educators who had overcome institutional corruption and student intimidation became a source of both practical guidance and emotional support for teachers who felt overwhelmed by the challenges they were facing. Amanda Foster, a mathematics teacher from Dallas, Texas, participated in one of our workshops after enduring months of harassment from students who objected to her rigorous academic standards and her refusal to provide extra credit opportunities that weren't available to all students equally. Her story was particularly relevant because it showed how academic integrity could become a flashpoint for conflict when families expected special treatment based on their social or economic status. The students who were harassing me had convinced themselves that I was being unfair by holding everyone to the same standards, Amanda explained to other workshop participants. They couldn't understand that their parents' donations to the school didn't entitle them to different rules or easier assignments. Amanda's situation had escalated when parents joined the campaign against her, filing complaints that questioned her teaching methods and demanding that she be reassigned to less advanced classes. The harassment included vandalism of her classroom, negative reviews posted online using fake accounts, and eventually direct threats that forced her to install security systems at her home. What Sarah's training taught me was that I needed to stop trying to reason with people who weren't interested in reasonable solutions, Amanda continued. Once I started documenting everything and treating their behavior as the criminal activity it actually was, the whole dynamic changed. Amanda's systematic approach to gathering evidence revealed that the harassment campaign against her was part of a broader effort by certain parent groups to influence curriculum decisions and personnel policies throughout her school district. Her documentation led to an investigation that exposed widespread corruption and resulted in significant reforms in how the district handled conflicts between educators and influential families. The success stories that emerged from our training program created a feedback loop that strengthened both the curriculum and the network of educators who supported each other through similar challenges. Teachers who had successfully overcome harassment became mentors and advocates for others facing similar situations, creating a community of resistance that made individual targeting much more difficult and less effective. Dr. Sarah Kim, an English teacher from Sacramento, California, had been harassed by students who objected to her assignment of books that included diverse authors and perspectives on American history. The campaign against her included attempts to get certain books banned from her curriculum, complaints about her teaching methods filed with various administrative levels, and eventually personal attacks that questioned her patriotism and her right to teach American literature. Before I participated in Sarah's training program, I felt like I was fighting this battle completely alone, Dr. Kim shared during a follow-up session. I thought that maybe I should just assign safer books and avoid controversial topics to make the harassment stop. The training had helped Dr. Kim understand that capitulating to harassment demands often escalated rather than resolved conflicts, and that educators who compromised their professional integrity to appease bullies usually found themselves facing additional demands that became increasingly unreasonable. Instead of changing her curriculum, she had documented the harassment campaign and built a case that demonstrated how the attacks on her were part of a broader effort to censor educational content throughout her district. Once I realized that this wasn't really about me personally, but about people trying to control what students learn and how teachers teach, I understood that fighting back was about more than just protecting myself, Dr. Kim explained. It was about protecting academic freedom and educational integrity for everyone. Her resistance had led to a federal civil rights investigation that revealed extensive evidence of coordinated attempts to influence curriculum decisions through intimidation and harassment of individual educators. The investigation resulted in policy changes that strengthened protections for academic freedom and created clear consequences for parents or students who attempted to influence educational content through harassment rather than appropriate administrative channels. These success stories reinforced my growing understanding that the confrontation with Tyler Brooks had been about much more than personal self-defense or individual justice. It had been part of a much larger struggle between those who believed that wealth and privilege should provide immunity from consequences and those who insisted that institutions should treat all community members with equal respect, regardless of their social or economic status. The training program continued to expand, reaching educators in rural districts where resources were limited and urban schools where harassment took different forms but followed similar patterns. Each new group of participants brought their own experiences and insights that enriched the curriculum and strengthened the network of support that had grown around the original incident at Riverside. 5 years after my confrontation with Tyler Brooks, I received an invitation that demonstrated how far the ripple effects of that single moment of resistance had spread. The National Education Association wanted me to speak at their annual conference about harassment prevention and institutional change, addressing an audience of thousands of educators from across the country. The invitation was both honoring and overwhelming. The quiet teacher who had tried to blend into the background and avoid conflict was being asked to speak to the largest gathering of educators in the nation about standing up to harassment and fighting for institutional change. The transformation felt complete and yet somehow still in progress. My speech focused on the lessons I had learned not just from my own experience, but from the hundreds of educators who had reached out to share their stories of harassment, resistance, and eventual victory over systemic corruption. The common themes that emerged from these stories had shaped my understanding of what was required to create lasting change in educational institutions. Individual courage is necessary but not sufficient, I told the audience. Real change happens when individual acts of resistance inspire institutional reforms that protect everyone, not just the people who are strong enough or skilled enough to fight back on their own. The speech was well received, but more importantly, it led to connections with national organizations that had the resources and influence to implement the training programs and support networks on a much larger scale. The Department of Education expressed interest in developing federal guidelines based on our curriculum, and several major universities wanted to incorporate our materials into their teacher preparation programs. The most meaningful response came from Tyler Brooks himself, who had completed his community service requirements and was working toward a degree in social work with a focus on conflict resolution. His letter arrived 3 weeks after my conference speech, written in careful handwriting that suggested he had drafted and redrafted it multiple times. "Miss Mitchell," he wrote, "I watched your speech online and wanted you to know that I understand now what I put you through and why you had to respond the way you did. I've spent the last 5 years learning about the damage that harassment can cause and working to become someone who prevents rather than creates that kind of harm." Tyler's letter went on to describe his work with young people who had been involved in bullying behaviors, helping them understand the impact of their actions and develop better strategies for resolving conflicts. He had apparently found purpose in using his own experience as a cautionary tale that could prevent others from making similar mistakes. "I know that apologizing can't undo what I did, and I'm not asking for forgiveness," Tyler continued. "But I wanted you to know that your refusal to be victimized changed my life in ways that I'm still discovering. The person I was when I attacked you was someone who believed that power came from making others feel weak. The person I'm becoming understands that real strength comes from helping others find their own power." His letter included updates on the other students who had been involved in the harassment campaign. Marcus Rivera was studying education and wanted to become a teacher himself. Motivated by his understanding of how institutional failures had enabled his participation in criminal behavior, Dylan Chen had become an advocate for victims of cyberbullying, using his technical skills to help law enforcement track down perpetrators of online harassment. The transformations described in Tyler's letter reinforced my belief that people were capable of fundamental change when they faced real consequences for harmful behavior and received appropriate support for developing better choices. The criminal justice system, the educational institutions, and the community interventions that had followed our confrontation had created opportunities for growth and redemption that wouldn't have existed if Tyler's behavior had been minimized or excused. Today, 10 years after that confrontation in the parking garage, I continue to teach at Riverside Preparatory Academy, but the school has become a model for how elite institutions can maintain high standards while treating all community members with dignity and respect. The policies and procedures that were implemented after Tyler's conviction have been adopted by other schools throughout the region, creating a network of institutions committed to preventing harassment and protecting vulnerable community members. The conflict resolution program I developed has grown into a comprehensive curriculum that addresses not just immediate safety concerns but also the underlying power dynamics that enable harassment and intimidation. Students learn to recognize manipulation tactics, document inappropriate behavior, and seek help from appropriate sources rather than suffering in silence or responding with violence. More importantly, they learn that institutions have responsibilities to protect all community members, and that individuals have both rights and obligations when it comes to creating safe, respectful environments. The program has dramatically reduced incidents of harassment while improving overall school climate and academic performance. The training programs for educators and administrators have now been implemented in over 40 states, reaching thousands of teachers and staff members who have used the tools and strategies to address harassment in their own communities. The network of support that grew from my original case continues to expand, connecting educators who face similar challenges and providing them with both practical resources and emotional encouragement. Dr. Rodriguez, now retired from law enforcement but continuing his work with the Department of Education, recently told me that my case had fundamentally changed how harassment investigations are conducted in educational settings. Before your case, a lot of investigators didn't understand the sophisticated tactics that privileged harassers use or the institutional pressures that prevent victims from reporting, he explained. Your documentation and the way you fought back showed us what comprehensive resistance looks like. The legal precedents established by Tyler's prosecution have been cited in numerous subsequent cases involving harassment in educational settings. Courts have recognized that systematic campaigns of intimidation constitute serious criminal behavior regardless of the age or social status of the perpetrators, and that institutional failures to address harassment can result in civil rights violations that carry significant penalties. Perhaps most significantly, the story has inspired changes in how we prepare future educators to recognize and respond to harassment. Teacher preparation programs now include modules on documenting inappropriate behavior, understanding legal protections and obligations, and developing the psychological resilience necessary to stand up to institutional pressure and individual intimidation. The quiet teacher who once tried to hide from her military past has become someone who helps others find the courage to fight for institutional change and personal dignity. Every day brings new challenges and new opportunities to support people who are facing the same kinds of systematic harassment that I once endured. Standing in my classroom this morning, watching students practice conflict resolution skills that will serve them throughout their lives, I'm reminded that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. The techniques I learned in the military were useful that day in the parking garage, but the real victory came from the decision to resist rather than submit, to fight for change rather than accept corruption. Every student who learns to stand up to bullying, every teacher who reports harassment instead of enduring it in silence, every administrator who prioritizes safety over donor relations continues the work that began with my refusal to change Tyler Brooks's grade. The individual moment of resistance has become a movement of institutional transformation that protects countless people who will never know the names of those who made their safety possible. That's the real lesson of what happened 10 years ago in that parking garage. Not that violence is the answer to institutional problems, but that courage is contagious, that individual resistance can spark collective change, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be victimized. The quiet teacher is gone, replaced by someone who understands that true peace sometimes requires the willingness to fight for justice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.